thank you, HTTP, for inviting me to participate in this important conversation. It is an honor for LULAC to serve as a founder and to have the pleasure to serve as a board member. The digital era has become the new face of inequity through the underrepresentation of communities of color and the lack of access to resources. Tech professionals of color make up less than 5% of the workforce at major tech companies, while most people who lack access to broadband live in rural, remote, low-income, and tribal lands. For instance, nearly 30% of Latino families don't have at-home internet service. This is the sad reality of today, and this is the reality that we at LULAC are fighting to amend. I recently met with mainstream media executives, urging for greater on-screen representation of Latinos. Representation matters. We need the diversity in our newsroom, on the air, on our apps, in our C-suites and boardrooms to match the diversity of our country. We've made it LULAC's priority to fight for equal access to broadband and tech equipment. And we've been following congressional relief funding really closely. Through the Affordable Connectivity Program, households can qualify for subsidized broadband support, but many in our communities are unaware of the benefits or how to apply. As the oldest and largest national Latino grassroots advocacy organization, our goal is to serve as an educational resource to push enrollment and build overall trust. Now, more than 10 million households are enrolled in the program, but I urge everyone here to spread the word even further to ensure no one in our communities is left behind. Today, I have the honor of introducing one of the senators behind the push for equal digital access, nuestro senador, Alex Padilla. Senador Alex Padilla hasn't been in federal office for long, but his impact has already been felt. He's made history as the first Latino to represent California in the U.S. Senate, and he's helped countless families by advocating and delivering equitable relief after COVID, and to push the federal government for more equity in STEM education. As an engineer, Senator Padilla understands that access to broadband is essential infrastructure, and he followed through by ensuring Californian schools and libraries could get their students and staff online during the pandemic. As a son of immigrants, he has dedicated his career to supporting communities often left behind, and he's fighting to ensure everyone has a fair shot at the American dream. Please join me in welcoming a friend and ally of LULAC and nuestra comunidad, el Senador Alex Padilla.
Hi, I'm Alex Padilla, and I have the honor of representing California in the United States Senate. As an engineer by training, I know how much technology shapes our lives, and yet STEM fields have a long way to go to better support diverse workers and more inclusive design. That's why I'm supporting a government-wide push to increase equity in STEM education. I've advocated for funding to improve STEM programs at Hispanic-serving institutions and build new partnerships between top research universities and minority-serving institutions. A more diverse STEM pipeline is key to maintaining America's leadership in innovation. I'm also proud to support the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to broadband for all. As the COVID-19 pandemic made clear, broadband is essential infrastructure. Businesses, workers, and students all know that a reliable high-speed internet connection is just as necessary as safe roads and bridges. But communities of color throughout the country face large disparities in broadband access. In California, we still have a lot of work to do to ensure that there's equitable access to broadband. We've come a long way since I first wrote the bill creating the California Advanced Services Fund in 2008 and expanded it in 2010 and 2013. Now, that legislation has funded hundreds of millions of dollars in grants and loans to support broadband across the state, especially in unserved and underserved areas. I championed those bills because of a 2008 report showing that 1.4 million Californians lacked access to broadband, and half of California residents only subscribe to low-speed dial-up internet. Today, the share of Californians with high-speed internet at home has risen dramatically. But broadband access and adoption still remains lower for Black and Latino households and tribal communities. I'm proud to have voted for the American Rescue Plan and the bipartisan infrastructure law, which are enabling the federal government to invest in bridging this divide. As we plan for the future of our economy, we need to go even further to build an inclusive digital future. And we need your voices to help create media and technology sectors that reflect and respond to the diversity of our nation. I want to thank the Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership for inviting me to join you today. I look forward to hearing the bold ideas that no doubt will come out of this summit.
Hola, mi gente. My name is Dacry Ryan, and I am the co-founder of Net the Collab, a digital advocacy and marketing firm dedicated to social justice. I'm really excited for our chat today. Make sure that you join the conversation on Twitter. Use the event hashtag DIS22, and make sure you tag HTTP policy. So, as someone who is a part of the civil rights policy ecosystem, I am continuously fascinated with the interconnectedness of the values and movements that mean the most to us and the power of our communities. We often don't see, though, what is the missing link there is the knowledge of policies and laws that affect our day-to-day lives. It's a personal passion of mine to help bring policy to the people and meet the communities we belong to where we are already at. And so luckily, the internet has made policy more accessible and on good days, even trendy. While, at its inception, the internet was an on-ramp to equity for many historically and intentionally marginalized communities, today it can be used as a tool of oppression. From disinformation campaigns that build on hate to target us, to algorithmic bias that intentionally is built to amplify some voices over others, there are a number of things to be concerned about in today's online world. And so part of what we will be discussing today is a law called Section 230. Section 230 was created in 1997 to give website owners the legal ability to moderate their own content. Essentially, this legally shields websites if one of their users posts something illegal. And now for some, this law is seen as an important tool for allowing speech from diverse groups of people to thrive online. But for others, this law is outdated and needs to be strengthened for civil rights protections. While there are some exceptions to Section 230 for copyright infringement and some sex work-related materials, the law has largely stayed the same since its inception in 1996, a time where we didn't even know what social media was, let alone what the social media landscape would look like today. And so with that, I'm very excited to welcome Rashad Robinson, the president of Color of Change, to chat with us today about Section 230 and its impact on our communities. Now, under Rashad's leadership, Color of Change designs and implements winning strategies for racial justice. Rashad, you and I have worked in the same field for a long time, and so I'm really excited to have this opportunity to chat with you one-on-one and with all of our virtual viewers, of course.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you, and thank you for your work.
Of course, thank you. So I think let's go ahead and jump right in. We often talk about the internet as a magical place that gives over storytelling and money-making power to historically and intentionally marginalized people. But that really assumes that the internet is equally and equally accessible to everyone. But you and I both know that that is just not how the internet is set up today. Unfortunately, between paid media, hate and violence online that spills over into our real lives, and platforms' lack of regulation, what are some things that concern you about this kind of dominance from platforms like Meta, aka Facebook? And what challenges do BIPOC creators and users face online today?
Well, first and foremost, I think we have to look at these platforms the way we look at all the different platforms that give us the ability to reach people. Just the other night, I watched this TV show on ABC called Abbott Elementary. Actually, it's an ABC show I watched on Hulu. I love this show. It's giving a young Black woman the ability to tell stories about a West Philadelphia public school, sort of the intersections of race and class and education, all these things. And it's happening on TV, and it's also on these platforms platforms, streaming platforms, and that doesn't mean that everything else on TV is great. It doesn't mean that TV doesn't need rules and regulation to sort of govern the type of content that goes on there. And so what's happening right now is the technology that is supposed to bring us into the future is dragging us into the past. And it's because we have outdated rules on how these platforms should have to they get to hold themselves accountable. And self-regulated companies are unregulated companies. And that, I think, is the biggest sort of takeaway. It's that we actually need rules of the road to ensure that these companies do not continue to create harm. And harm ends up going downstream. So those that have less power in our society end up bearing the greatest brunt, while those with the greatest amount of power end up making the most money off of those harms created. And Section 230, which you just, brilliantly outlined, I think really is one of those key areas of a rule that needs updating to sort of meet the needs of the 21st century.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought up Abbott Elementary, because that is my fiance and I's favorite show right now. So everyone watching, go watch it. It's hilarious. But that, I think, is a perfect segue into my next question for you. The audience heard my spiel on Section 230, but what's Color of Change's take on Section 230? Does it need to be amended, strengthened, left alone?
So I recently testified before Congress, along with Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, and I've also recently co-chaired the Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder, along with Chris Krebs and Katie Couric, along with 15 other commissioners from various walks of life, and who've been working on these issues, and really sort of looking at reforms that both deal with the importance of upholding the First Amendment, dealing with all the ways in which we need to make our voices heard, while also recognizing that these companies have business models that are actually causing harm that have nothing to do with the First Amendment. And so some of the reforms that we're actually really focusing on is really dealing with the business model. The fact of the matter is that that these companies are not just putting up content that other people are writing, they are making recommendations of who you should follow. They are prioritizing what type of content gets in front of you. They have a whole paid advertising program. And none of that should be immune from the type of accountability for the harm that it should be done. And we can create rules that do allow all of us as individuals to raise our voices. As a person who has sort of stood outside of some of these companies and sometimes been in the boardrooms with the CEOs, has forced these companies to actually have to conduct racial equity audits and then watch them as they did not implement racial equity, those sort of the recommendations of the racial equity audits. I recognize that we continue to sort of play this sort of circular dance with these companies where we're begging them to uphold rules of civil rights when we should never have to beg billionaires to actually have to sort of deal with the rule of law, that we actually have a government and the government needs to hold these companies accountable. And where rules need to be updated, we need to do that. And so the fight for folks of color, for Black and Brown communities in particular, to think about sort of all the ways in which these companies get to sort of dictate the demands. I think about Facebook, and over 80% of their moderators are English language moderators. And the rest of that is all the other languages globally. They have created such an opening for information disorder that we don't even know what's happening, and they don't know what's happening. But the communities that are actually getting the brunt of that information, it's impacting conversations and data about health, about education, about our democracy and how to vote. All of these things are under attack, and these platforms are raking in money and not being held accountable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think Congressman Tony Cardenas always says, right, we all have that one tia that just shares all of this stuff on Facebook, and we have to kind of rein it in. And I think that's, definitely to what you're saying of non-English content moderation is just falling through the cracks. Yeah. And so as we kind of talk about making sure that we're not just trusting these platforms to regulate themselves. Aside from Section 230, are there any other tools in our tool belt that we can use to try and hold them accountable?
So I think about, the audience that we've got here. So we've got people who are probably connected to these platforms in some way, probably folks in government, people who have leadership roles throughout other aspects of society. And it's going to take all of society to deal with information disorder. Yes, there have to be new rules for the platforms, but we also have to have institutions that accredit our lawyers, our doctors, our educators to hold those folks who might be moving and advancing misinformation and disinformation accountable. We need rules for the platforms about how they sort of prioritize and uplift the super spreaders on these platforms and deal with all the ways in which they remove sort of privileges from those folks. We have to, have rules and have sort of a look at the future, at sort of what are the investments that can be made in communities that have been deeply harmed by this information and disinformation. Though some of the ways in which cigarette companies had to sort of make real investments into those communities. And at a higher level, we have to deal with antitrust. We have to deal with the consolidation of big companies that are sort of in some ways that we have no ability to regulate them. But that's going to take leadership across all of these sectors. It's going to take leadership in government. It's going to take leadership in the platforms. It's going to take leadership in the private sector. And it's also going to take all of us to hold our elected leaders accountable. I oftentimes say this about where we're at in this moment in time, where we have, big unregulated companies that get to set their own rules. The reason why the meat is safe in our supermarkets, the reason why our seatbelts work in our cars is not because of the altruism of big agriculture and the food industry or the altruism of the auto industry. It's because of a set of rules and accountability on those industries to actually meet safety standards. And that happened because of movements of everyday people. So we will always lose in the back rooms if we don't have the people lined up at the front door. Elevating this as a key issue and holding those in power accountable to actually do something. Far too often when we are working to sort of advance legislation or move legislation, the big platforms come in with their lobbyists, and they're always going to come in with more money, more resources, sort of a better story about what they maybe can do in the next election cycle. And so we're going to need more of us involved in prioritizing this issue. I always believe that the people facing money and power can always win, but the people have to have a strategy and the people have to be organized.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. Mm-hmm. And thank you for kind of naming that dynamic too. I think that's something we forget about, is that these are corporations, just like in any other industry, right, that have almost unlimited resources when it comes to kind of squashing what we take so long to build up on the social justice and movement side. And I think that's a great kind of segue into our wrap up here. I really want us to drive home the impact of this issue for our communities. Why should communities of color, why should Black and Brown folks care about disinformation and platform accountability? What does that translate to in their everyday lives? And then what can they do to get involved?
Well, information disorder, disinformation is a problem that impacts all other problems in society. When bad information outweighs good information, it creates consequences for our health, for our education, for our ability to express our will for a better future through our democracy. It impacts every aspect of life. And the impacts on communities that have been traditionally under attack, I don't want to call our communities vulnerable, because talking about our communities as vulnerable really removes what's actually been done to our communities. We're not vulnerable. We're not weak. We have been targeted, attacked, exploited. And so part of what we actually need to recognize here is that so many of the problems that exist in society are about the need for structural change. And what we're dealing with information disorder is not because Black and brown communities are broken. It's because we have systems and structures which have been designed to harm us. This inequality that we are facing has been manufactured, and the problems that we are facing has been manufactured for profit. And we have to do the work to change the rules, to build new sets of power, and to translate that into the type of changes that our communities deserve. This is one of the key issues, civil rights issues of our time, because it will be hard to win on so many of the challenges we are facing if we are facing every single day an environment where the facts cannot actually beat the lies.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm fired up, so I hope everyone in the audience is too. Thank you so much for that, Rashad, and thank you so much for being here today. This has really been, a truly important conversation, and I'm glad that we could share this time together. I'm really excited for the next talk as well. If you're in the audience, please stay on. My really good friend, KJ Bakshi, is going to dive into part 2 of this conversation.
Hey, everyone, and thanks to Daiquiri for that very fascinating conversation with Rashad. I think we definitely learned a lot, and I'm excited to talk with my colleague here today, Elizabeth, to kind of continue on the conversation on Section 230. But before jumping in, I definitely want to thank HTTP for hosting this summit and for allowing us to have this conversation today. My name's KJ Bagchi. I'm the Senior Director of Federal Public Policy at the Chamber of Progress. We're a new center-left tech trade association focused on technology's progressive future. Before we jump in to the conversation, I also wanted to give a little bit of background on my colleague, Elizabeth Banker, who's joining us. She has been working on Section 230 issues since the beginning, really, for about 25 plus years now. And she's been working on these issues from a variety of perspectives, including in companies like Yahoo and Twitter, where she worked on safety and content issues and was involved in the litigation of some key Section 230 cases. I'm very fortunate because I get to work with her more closely now that she's joined us at the Chamber of Progress as our Vice President of Legal Advocacy. I want to bring Elizabeth in, and just to start us off, can you, talk to us a little bit about why communities of color or other diverse communities should be paying attention to this conversation around Section 230?
Sure, KJ. The universe of people who depend on Section 230 is really broad, and it extends far beyond the tech companies that we usually talk about, whether it's local newspapers or community blogs, Wikipedia, online petition and online fundraising sites. I mean, the list kind of goes on. But what I want to highlight really is that Section 230 helps groups and individuals who want to speak out to create change. And we've seen Section 230 come up in cases involving things like the Plainview Project, which is designed to shine a light on racism in the police. We've seen it with environmental activists, organizing through things like Facebook pages, and material related to the Me Too movement.
So it's always fascinated me about the conversation around Section 230 is that it is definitely it's codified law, but really when it's used on a day-to-day basis or in our courts, it actually functions as more of a procedural tool, right? Rather than some kind of blanket immunity that, a lot of sort of opponents and critics will talk about. They'll use this terminology, blanket immunity, but really it's a process tool. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Sure. I actually put out a paper in 2020 where I had done a review of about 500 decisions involving Section 230. And there were some really interesting findings, because I think when people, as you say, think about 230, they think about it just automatically stops cases in their tracks. And a few of the things that I found were that courts frequently dismiss lawsuits even where 230 was brought up, without ever reaching the issue. So something like 25% of the cases I looked at, that's what happened, because there were legal flaws with the underlying claims. And so the court never had to get to 230. I think, a great example that often comes up as a reason for 230 reform are cases involving social media and allegations of material support of terrorism, where most of those cases were dismissed because of a lack of causation. And so I think that's one good example. I just want to say we also see courts scrutinize when providers and others assert Section 230 to see if it applies. There are exceptions for IP, things like FOSTA, and courts definitely will recognize when those exceptions apply and refuse to apply 230. So I think that's important to know.
True, and it's also with Section 230, if it doesn't apply in a case, then whoever the defendant is, right? If it's a big tech company, a smaller company, whoever's applying it, they still have to go proceed with the case, right? Like it's not the conversation about liability, is still pursued if Section 230 is not granted in that situation, right?
Absolutely. I think maybe I'll use an example. One of the cases that comes up all the time is the old Fair Housing Council versus roommates.com case, which related to housing discrimination. Roommates, and this was a very important case in the development of 230 jurisprudence, was denied Section 230 protection related to a questionnaire that they had developed where users just put in multiple choice answers because of their role in the development of the content. While they did receive 230 immunity for open text boxes. That case went on to be litigated, and ultimately the Ninth Circuit found that roommates didn't violate the fair housing laws. So, it's interesting. Every time I see that case talked about, it's always in the context, even in judicial opinions, of the illegal questionnaire that ultimately was determined by a court not to be illegal.
No, that is fascinating. And it definitely does come up a lot in discourse. The idea that if somehow, this actually leads to my next kind of question, that there's this sort of, misinformation about the idea that if Section 230 doesn't apply, then all of a sudden there's automatic liability. But from that example you're showing, it still gets litigated and those questions still can get answered. Nothing is guaranteed. And, so to that topic of this idea of trying to find ways to take away that 230 application, we've seen a number of bills in Congress focused on essentially chipping away at when 230 applies, creating these carve-outs from Section 230 that relate to a number of topics that, that we're trying to address in the online ecosystem. They're trying to create carve-outs for health misinformation, the sale of firearms, personalized algorithms that choose what content to show a user. And there's also a bill that seeks to take away 230 protection in those cases where a targeted ad was found to violate a user's civil rights. Now, I think these are all important topics, and on the surface, it definitely, these are issues we should be having conversations about. But when you see the topic that's being addressed and you see the bill that's trying to address this issue, from your perspective, do you think that these are actually having the outcome that they're aiming for? Is there an actual benefit for diverse consumer bases based on just what the legislation is actually trying to do?
Well, I think that's a really great question, and these are really important issues. But I think, for many of these, when we look at how they'll function in practice, we see that, it all kind of leads back to the original reason why Section 230 was passed, which is this kind of uncomfortable situation where we know from First Amendment jurisprudence that you can't hold an intermediary strictly liable. You really can only do it if they have knowledge. And so without Section 230, we still have that First Amendment reality. And now we have this new disincentive for a provider to do anything that would potentially put them on notice, which is really what content moderation is about. I think good content moderation is providers being proactive and going and looking for things that, frankly, many of these bills are intended to address. But I think we have to be realistic and know that providers aren't going to be able to be perfect, particularly in the areas where there's a lot of nuance. And I think this is why we've seen, that companies prefer bright lines. They're not great unless they have those bright lines. And so they're either going to overcorrect or just adopt really broad rules, or they may actually kind of throw up their hands and say, I don't know how to deal with this, so I'm not. Twitter decided, for example, not to run political ads, for the election. And I think that's a great example, similar to what companies did around FOSTA.
So why do you think Section 230 has been this sort of political football? Like, what is it about the law itself, the discourse? Just, you've been working on this for quite some time. You've seen how political parties have been using it to their advantage in their discourse. But why is 230 always popping up? Like, why is it the central theme in all these conversations?
I wish I knew, but I think it's really misunderstood. And I can understand why people, when they hear that there's this blanket immunity for these huge companies, just have very visceral reactions to that. But I think it really loses sight of, when we look at the cases that have been litigated, just, how broad the impact of Section 230 is and what it would mean for, consumers of services, users, individuals in their everyday life, organizations, if that protection wasn't there. And so, I can see why, from a political perspective, kind of harnessing that emotional response to this idea of blanket immunity might be attractive. But I just think in terms of making sure we're doing things that benefit, individuals, and make sure that the way people want to use online services, they can continue to do that. It's just really important to be very mindful of the realities of how Section 230 works.
No, that makes sense. I mean, it sounds like Section 230 could really benefit from a publicist to kind of help out with sort of some of this sort of the kind of misdirection out there. But, just again, you said something that I want to kind of come back to. You talked about bright lines. And, I think from my perspective, I think even our partner companies that work with us, I think they understand that there will be a regulatory framework that they need to play in. And Section 230 has its role in that kind of framework. But, we are hearing from some folks, right, in political discourse, just talk about just getting rid of Section 230 altogether. And, I'm curious, again, like you've worked in this sort of area of jurisprudence for quite some time, to have it just all of a sudden just chucked out the window. What would you say to those folks who are really passionately arguing to get rid of this law?
Well, I'm old, and so I remember the internet before user-generated content. Really, I think in the early days when Section 230 had just passed, there was very little case law. And there was a lot of caution about how users were able to express themselves. And, so much of the content that was available to people online was actually licensed content, with, contracts and indemnity agreements, kind of supporting it, to make sure that the providers weren't too exposed. And I think, we look now at the way we use the internet, and, there's this entire thing called the creator economy that apparently is huge. And, things like that just can't exist in the same way in the absence of Section 230. So, I think this may repeat some of my earlier points, but I just want to emphasize that, Section 230 really is critical to give a platform to voices that are outside the mainstream or challenge the powers that be or aren't well funded enough to pay for placement. At the same time, it's also essential if you want to encourage providers to be more proactive in terms of removing content that is harmful. Right now, providers are getting hauled into court at alarming rates for taking things down, things like hate speech, incitement to violence, and misinformation. Section 230 protects the providers in those cases. And if that protection goes away, I think it's reasonable to think that content moderation is actually going to decrease.
No, that makes sense. I mean, I think, just as we start wrapping up our conversation, I think the central theme, of our kind of conversation today is that Section 230 has its place. And I do think we would all acknowledge that there are definitely concerns and issues in the online ecosystem that, are really impacting diverse communities. And while Section 230 is, hopefully we've kind of peeled back the layers a little bit to show that there is some nuance to understanding 230 and how tinkering with it or even trying to get rid of it may have, far worse consequences than the ones that we could imagine. But I want to leave our audience with, instead of sort of defending an idea and saying no to everything, I do want to leave our audience with some ideas of policy areas that they should be thinking about, policy areas in the tech space that they should be encouraging their policymakers to pursue. What are some of those topics that come to mind for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you referenced the popularity of Section 230 as in the political discourse, and honestly, changing Section 230 is not the solution to every problem. And so I think there are great examples where other things can be done that are going to be more useful. For example, ad targeting and discrimination. Likely better addressed through things like increased privacy protections, including consumer controls, required risk assessments, and more accountability for companies. So I think ideas like that are really promising and would have a lot of additional benefits beyond addressing that one issue. So it would be great to be able to get some momentum towards working on those sorts of things.
No, I think you're right. And I think earlier I had mentioned concerns about civil rights protections in the online space. And again, we've seen privacy legislation kind of move through Congress and now subsequently get stalled. But the conversations about how do you protect a user's data to ensure that it can't somehow be used against them in a way that would violate their civil rights. So I agree. I do think that, the call to privacy and comprehensive privacy legislation, I think, continues for sure as we head into this year. Well, that kind of wraps up our discussion. Thank you, Elizabeth, for this great conversation. And with that, I guess we'll turn it back over to the host to continue on these great conversations. Thanks all.
The internet continues to expand the reach of our voices, our culture, our stories, and our ingenuity. From abuelitas sharing their cooking secrets, hilarious memes, to dance challenges, to comedy made for us, by us. Over the course of our program today, we have been sharing a few examples of how multicultural creators are thriving by creating content that resonates with all of us. Here's a few more examples from one of my personal favorites at Maya in the Moment.
Si vienen a bailar, pues vamos a gozar. Si vienen a dormir, salgan fuera de aquí. Este es el ritmo de mi cumbia que te va a mover. La cumbia que te traigo te la haré yo sé. Para que muevas tu cuerpo de la cabeza a los pies. Y ahora que estamos de pie se repitan todos después. Hey, hey, oh, oh, hey, hey, no me dejes.
Hi, I'm Latina, and I learned Spanish as an adult. I already know I offended a bunch of people. Hi, how are you doing? I could always understand it, but I was too afraid to speak it because people within our own community are pretty much like, what a disgrace you are to our culture. First of all, can we be more creative with our insults and the shame? Where's the creativity nowadays? It's dead. This is just a PSA for my people who feel the same way as me. Maybe you're still in the embarrassment stage where you haven't learned yet but want to. If you get people telling you these things like you're not enough, just know that it's a projection. It has nothing to do with you. Whether you want to learn or not is your choice and your business. And even if you do want to learn, please learn for yourself and not for the gatekeepers of the culture. Because I don't think they like themselves. I don't think they like anything. Also, wasn't the Spanish language forced upon us by... Hi, this is a message for you. So please listen up closely. Put the phone right up to your ear. Let it go. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Let it go. Stop dwelling on it. Stop replaying conversations in your head of the things you should have said and didn't say. Stop doing this in the shower, in the car, because it happened. It's done. It's over. Let it go. And it's making us really sad to freaking think about it all the time. It feels like a prison in our head. I don't want that. And we're probably blocking like another amazing, cool person or experience by keeping these thoughts in our head. So please let it